Dennis O'Rourke.
Mr Speaker, New Zealand First joins all of the other parties to ensure that there are adequate government powers so that what needs to be done to make sure that the people of Kaikōura and other affected areas get what they need and they get it quickly and effectively. Without these sorts of powers, it's unlikely that that would happen. So we have no difficulty in supporting a bill for that reason. And also we have no difficulty with the shortened time frame within which the bill will pass. We think it's one of those pieces of legislation that we ought to be able to deal with quickly and effectively in the way that is actually proposed. In addition to the Hurunui Kaikōura Earthquake Emergency Relief Bill, which has had a lot of attention this week, this bill, which I think of as the Order in Council bill, is certainly needed, but there need to, of course, be appropriate checks and balances to exempt, modify or extend the provisions of certain enactments, as it says in the explanatory note. And Mr Speaker, it is those checks and balances that the Select Committee will particularly need to focus on because, as others have said, these are pretty extraordinary powers. So subject to that, New Zealand First will be very happy to support the bill. And I just want to go through some of the aspects of those checks and balances which we're going to need to pay particular attention to over the next few days. And the first thing, of course, to note is that it only applies to a relatively discrete area of the country, the affected areas, as they are called in the bill. And most particularly, though, any order made must be necessary or desirable for the purposes of the bill and not be broader than is reasonably necessary. Now, because that's the crux of the bill and the most important of the checks and balances, we ought to pay particular attention to the words used, which are, by which I mean looking at the purposes of the bill. And they are set out in clause 3, and I'm going to read them out because I think it's important that that be done. So A is to provide for economic recovery, B to provide for the planning, rebuilding and recovery of affected communities and persons, including 1, the repair and rebuilding of land, infrastructure and other property of affected communities or of affected persons. 2, safety enhancements to and improvements to the resilience of such land infrastructure or other property. And then it goes on with C, facilitate coordinated efforts and processes used to bring about the short-term, medium-term and long-term recovery enhancement of affected communities. And lastly, there is D, to facilitate the restoration and improvement of the environmental, economic, social and cultural well-being and resilience of affected communities or of affected persons. So it's fairly wide-ranging and covers affected communities and affected persons and provides for safety enhancements and also improvements so that they get the resilience they will need for the future. And I think that's most appropriate because we do need to remember that this is not a past event. This is a current and future event. It's a sequence of earthquakes that will definitely carry on, and indeed future events may even be larger and more damaging than those we've had already. So I think it's important to particularly think about the purposes in relation to that, the first and most important of the checks and balances, necessary or desirable to achieve those purposes. But Mr Speaker, in addition to that, there is a panel to be appointed under clause 12, and I think it's very important that that panel be of people with real expertise, whether it be environmental, construction, agricultural, cultural or whatever, because again you need to refer back to the purposes of the legislation. So I'll be interested to see who ultimately gets appointed. I'm sure a good job will be done and they will do a good job themselves. In addition to that, there is a provision for the draft of any order to have to go to the Regulations Review Committee, or if it's not possible to get that together, then at least to the leader of each of the political parties represented in Parliament. So that provides for another important check and balance and ensures that there won't be any politicisation of the process, and none of us want to see that. And of course, the bill makes it very clear that the responsible minister, whichever one it may be, must actually have regard to the recommendations or the comments of both that panel and of the Regulations Review Committee. So there won't be a free hand here. I think those are important provisions in the bill. In addition to that, there is an engagement process provided for under Clause 9, and that provides for the engagement of substantially affected persons, but also the public, if the local authority believes that it should do that in respect of any particular order. I think that's very important because as we've seen in the Christchurch earthquake, it's very easy for people to feel alienated from these processes. So I hope that the local authority makes sure it does a good job in that respect too. The minister, in deciding to make an order, must record and give reasons, and I think that's very important that that be on the record. I want to also approve particularly of Clause 11, and I think this is better than what was done for the Canterbury earthquakes, because what it does is to list, first of all, some legislation that can't be amended by any of the orders made under this bill, and they include acts like the Bill of Rights Act and the Electoral Act, which is what you would expect, but also it provides for a list, I understand, of 2 or 3 dozen bills which are those which can be amended under this legislation, with a provision for other such bills to be added. It's a good idea to do it that way rather than have some general provision trying to cover the whole thing. In addition to all of that, Mr. Speaker, you have to remember that this legislation will have limited duration, and the orders under it will be revoked on the 31st of March 2018 or sooner than that. So it's not as though this is going to go on for a very long time. Hopefully that will be a long enough period so that any of the orders necessary under this legislation can in fact be made. In addition to that, Clause 17 provides for additional areas, and as I've already said, additional acts to be added to the application of the bill in certain limited circumstances that are set out in the bill. So, Mr. Speaker, we in New Zealand First do believe that this bill is absolutely necessary, that the checks and balances ought to be adequate, that the people of Kaikōura and indeed the people of New Zealand should have confidence that the powers granted will not be excessive and there will be proper supervision and limitations on them. So as I've said, it's a necessary bill. It's properly balanced with appropriate checks and balances. It's something that I believe that will be an important aspect of the recovery of Kaikōura and other affected areas, and I look forward to taking part in the select committee process to go through the bill and make sure that what I've said actually is the case, and that legislation will properly record and state that. So, having said all of that, Mr. Speaker, I do want to say that the process so far with the emergency legislation has been very good. I think the process for this is likely to be just as good, and for that reason New Zealand First will have no hesitation in supporting this bill.
Ian